emissions are no longer following the worst-case scenario. I may be out of depth here, but does anyone else also think that measuring emissions is a kind of bullshit? First, it is not very precise in the first place, but let's assume it is. Second, the effects of the GH gases in atmosphere is not linear. Scientists hypothesize about different thresholds which can be reached at certain global temperature points. Like for example West Antarctic shield detaching, Gulf Stream interruption, sedimentary ocean methane release, permafrost methane release, etc. All these can rapidly change our climate while emissions would be steady or even receding. Third, even level emissions would still continue heating up the planet, and heating rate would increase even with the level state of emissions, simply because old, already emitted gases are still in the atmosphere. I think it is more fair to measure temperatures directly, as we already do, and make estimates from there. It's not the CO2 which would harm us, at least not that much, it's the temperature, so we need to base our analysis on the thing that interests us directly, and not on the derivative of it, emission rates. I suspect it doesn't matter how good are our models or how good are humanity's efforts in green tech. Until we are actually removing gases from the atmosphere permanently, the planet is fucked. Just faster or slower, doesn't really matter. Until we are actually removing gases from the atmosphere permanently, the planet is fucked. Just faster or slower, doesn't really matter. If I have a cancer, and a lifestyle change would make the difference between whether the cancer kills me in 4 years or 40. I definitely wouldn't say, I'm fucked anyway. No point in doing anything unless the cancer can be permanently removed. This is some really bizarre logic. It's not the guy with thin gun, it's the bullet. Let's avoid them. I think the secondary things you describe are almost large-scale weather events, not quite climate. But most fundamentally, the primary driver of temperature change is CO2, and that's that, so of course we have to measure it. And yes, it's far more fuzzy than they let on, which is not good. They should be more open about that, or find a way to communicate it more effectively. No, the planet is not all fucked, and CO2 levels will go down as we put less in the air, and of course, if we want to start to decarbonize the atmosphere we can do that as well. I wish they would use the term climate risk, because risk all about less likely probabilities than specific paths to the future. CO2 levels will go down as we put less in the air. What? You are saying that if you're cooking meat on a skillet and turn the fire down from 3 to 1, or even to 0, then your meat temperature would start actively decreasing below the ambient temperature and freeze on its own? Because that's what you are saying, literally. I'm not against measuring emission rates, that's an important metric. I'm against making any far-reaching assumptions based only on the emission rates estimates. Because that's like cooking meat inside an opaque black box by measuring torque forces applied to the regulator over time. It loosely corresponds to the result, but the meat would be charred most likely, due to big amount of conversions and estimations. On the other hand, measuring meat temperature with a thermometer inserted directly into it would give us a precision result. I believe they are claiming that various processes break down or passively absorb CO2 in the air. So if emissions stopped by some magic, CO2 levels would not be steady but decreasing, even without other interventions. The planet is fucked. The planet will be fine. It will be different, but that's a normal thing in its 4 billion year history. Whether it will be habitable for humans is a different question. I suspect we'll adapt, like we did for the last ice age, but I'm no expert. On the bright side, more heat and CO2 means more arable land and better growing environment. Veggies and grazing animals are all I need to get by, food-wise. People are misunderstanding George Carlin's stand-up so much. Yes, the planet will be fine. The ball of molten iron will be fine. It's just that current ecosystem will die out, but apparently it's fine. We will adapt probably, but billions will die. A simple hypothesis, let's say due to the global warming rice crops will fail globally. Just imagine how many people would be affected and how many nuclear wars started for the remaining resources. Smiley face. What climate change-induced mechanism could cause a global rice crop failure? Would it also cause global failure of grain, corn, beans, potatoes, etc.? The hypothesis seems so far-fetched to me as to be dismissible out of hand. I can understand how, over a period of years, farms near the equator may become less tenable and land farther from the equator more arable. But, at the scales of seen, single-digit average degrees up over the next 100 years, We should be able to account for that. Edit. I don't know the Carlin bit you refer to. Link? The norm for planet Earth is for the environment to change drastically over millions of billions of years, though sometimes in mere moments, e.g., asteroid smash. Life as we know it since its inception has also survived all of those changes. So Earth will be fine and life will go on. The only thing that will destroy everything is when the sun goes om nom nom many billions of years from now as it feasts upon its inner children to become a red giant. More heat and CO2 means a higher sea level, which will lead to the loss of arable land, not gain. I've been unable to find a source either way. Can you help? Just looking casually at topo maps and assuming the worst case I've seen. All land and sea ice melts, resulting in seawater rising 250 feet. The land we'll lose in coastal regions and major river basins is smaller than what we'll gain near the poles. Farming just Antarctica would probably produce enough food to feed the world several times over. Edit. This isn't to say that worst-case scenario wouldn't displace high percentages of the population or that that isn't a major issue. However, it's not an insurmountable obstacle given the gradual nature of the change. Lest the lead be buried. What does this flattening of emissions and divergence from the high-end scenario mean for the climate going forward? First, it's important to emphasize that a flattening of emissions does not mean that global warming will stop or the problem will be solved. The amount of warming the world experiences is a function of our cumulative emissions, and the world will not stop warming until we get emissions all the way to net zero. Even after we reach net zero emissions, the world will not cool back down for many millennia to come in the absence of removing more CO2 from the atmosphere than we emit. This is the brutal math of climate change, and the reason why it's so important to start reducing our emissions quickly. We are already well off track for what would be needed to limit warming to 1.5 C without large overshoot, and the need for lots of negative emissions to bring temperatures back down. If we do not start reducing global emissions over the coming decade, plausible scenarios to limit warming to below 2°C will move out of reach as well. In other words, this is heartening progress, but not an excuse for apathy. What's very important to note is that a big bulk of the recent reductions have come from picking low-hanging fruits, i.e. by replacing coal with natural gas. This does not mean that going to zero will be possible with just more of the same. How the fact that we're seeing a 80% reduction in insect population fits in all of this. Honestly asking, I think it's really worrisome and not getting the attention it deserves. This is good news, but I hope this was a real change and not solved by creative accounting, e.g. stopping counting some emissions as emissions. I will have to look at the reference data for this. Hard to argue with robust monitoring of CO2 concentrations which are now increasing linearly rather than exponentially, i.e. emissions are constant instead of increasing. I wonder if COVID and/or inflation somehow started a trend of economic slowdown that allowed emissions to slow down. It means that somehow, if we care about the environment, we may have to be against economic growth and/or good economic health. I think we should live humble, but I can see that companies producing things just put on green robes and say, throw out your old car and buy this one because it's much more eco. All that forcing by law to throw out old things to get something more eco-friendly is so immoral and insincere, hypocritical. I was missing a word. All that forcing by law to throw out old things to get something more eco-friendly is so immoral it's not. Local emissions are a thing. A new car will have way cleaner exhaust than a 20-year-old beater, and an electric vehicle even less. Nitrous oxide is the big issue in urban areas. The less of it is in the air the better for those having to live near high-traffic streets. Have you calculated amount of CO2 required to produce a new car? Why no one is fighting to convert those existing vehicles to electric? Why nobody produces filters for used cars? Maybe because companies do not have interest in it, and this way there is nothing changed. Just produce the same, but with new type of engine. Even better, because more money is earned. Meanwhile, ecology is about putting down the production, but the production blossoms for some reason. Somewhere half of the total emissions produced by a car are produced manufacturing it. This is how you can buy a gas-powered car and have lower emissions than an electric F-150, Rivian, Hummer, etc. because those require so much more steel and thus manufacturing emissions. Improving local emissions is good, but it doesn't help with global emissions if you're still buying a couple tons of metal which will sit idle 95% of the time and will on average haul 1.1 people when in use. There's also a concern that EVs not only don't help but actually worsen the health impacts of tire particulates. They might take away my US passport for saying it, but if we want to reduce emissions, the solution isn't spending more. The best options are things like walking, biking, taking transit, and eating less beef. Tertullian circa 100 to 200 AD. The strongest witness is the vast population of the earth to which we are a burden, and she scarcely can provide for our needs. As our demands grow greater, our complaints against nature's inadequacy are heard by all. The scourges of pestilence, famine, wars and earthquakes have come to be regarded as a blessing to overcrowded nations since they serve to prune away the luxuriant growth of the human race. We have been beating this same drum for nearly 2,000 years, at least. Nothing is new. We're tripping ourselves ad infinitum. Am I right that the source does not count pollutions created from warheads explosions? Those are also exploding fossil fuels and exposing the greenhouse gases, and amount of warheads spent is not being declared anywhere. I'll put it to you this way. All the militaries of all the countries in everything they do are responsible for 6% of the CO2 emissions. I'll let you figure out why explosions alone were not mentioned at all. All the militaries of all the countries in everything they do are responsible for 6% of the CO2 emissions. I have quickly Googled that statement and all I see is pre-02/24/22 data. I am sure the percent has changed significantly from the good old times.